And we are joined now by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. He is the only black Republican in the Senate. Good morning, Senator Scott. I wanted to start beneath all the smoke over the weekend are calls for systemic change. But the White House National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien over the weekend said, I don't think there's systemic racism. 99.9% of our law enforcement officials are great Americans, he said. You yourself have described being stopped 7 times in a year. Do you think there's systemic racism, and how should we address it?
Well, there's no doubt that our nation, the original sin was that of racism. There's a reason why in the Constitution I was 3/5 of a man. The question is what's changed since then? We've made a lot of progress, but let's just be clear. There's a lot of progress still to be made. One of the reasons why I've encouraged the White House to take a look at having the Department of Justice focus on race and justice is because it's one of the areas where Americans want fairness. If there's a place in this nation that we need to have leaps in the right direction, it's in our justice system and fairness. One of the things we all celebrated, Republicans and Democrats, blacks and whites, was the criminal justice reform package that was passed a couple of years ago because there was an unfair application of the law in sentencing, and we wanted to see that corrected. You saw people come together, Cory Booker, myself, the president, Van Jones, all working towards the same outcome. If we took that same energy and focused first on Mr. Floyd is dead because an officer murdered him. Mr. Arbery is dead because 2 guys in a pickup truck shot him in the middle of the street at 1 p.m. For someone to suggest that there aren't racial challenges and patterns is for someone to be blind. And so we cannot deny the truth, but we, at the same time, I just said this recently, we need to address this issue, this very difficult issue, by recognizing that you can both make progress and have parts of it look like regression. We have to see both sides of the picture. It's not a binary choice. It's a choice of progress, and sometimes there's a regressive state. We can make them both work together better if we're focused.
But Senator, if you're not acknowledging the problem, as the National Security Advisor does not seem to be, how do you change something you're not even acknowledging?
Well, there's about 340,999,000 other Americans that we can all work together to do so. The fact that one person doesn't see it the way that it should be seen, that is clear and evident for me when I walk into the Capitol and I'm stopped, even with my Senate pin on, because I'm an African American. They didn't believe my pin was mine. I get it, but I'm not going to focus my attention in the midst of this challenge on one individual who got it wrong. I want to focus my attention on folks like John Lewis, that peaceful protesting led to systemic change in our nation. If all we do is celebrate the negative, and frankly, I know it sells better, we'll miss the very important point. The essence of the point is every single American wants to understand their own intrinsic value and want to allow that to be expressed publicly. When you can't go for a jog as an African American man, that questions whether or not your intrinsic value is on par with every other American. So we need to wrestle with these very significant issues. For those who believe that racism is dead and gone and that 99.9% of any group is pure, they're just living in a different universe. I will say that the vast majority of law enforcement officers are good, but we need to deal with the ones that are not as well.
Senator, you've spoken with the president. You told him that you reportedly that you thought his first tweets calling some of the protesters thugs and that when the looting starts, the shooting starts was not constructive. He has since offered condolences to the family, but he has not discussed solving a systemic problem. Do you want him to address that? Has he indicated to you he will?
Well, the president and I did have a constructive conversation on Saturday. I thought he was very much in a listening mode, and I thank him for that. We did talk about next steps going forward. Certainly, I suggested that it would be good for us to have a conversation with some of the leading voices in the African American community and some of the leading voices in the law enforcement community without a bunch of cameras, though. I want a real raw conversation where people get to understand and appreciate the other's perspective. I did that with Congressman Trey Gowdy in South Carolina after the Walter Scott shooting, after the church shooting. I wanted to bring communities of color together with law enforcement so that we could actually have a conversation without cameras. It literally led to law enforcement officers and pastors doing ride-alongs and having a raw conversation. I'll never forget a black pastor who said, "I'm afraid for my life, but I'm more afraid for the life of my child when he's driving down the road." That's a serious challenge.
Do you think, very quickly, Senator, do you think the president sees that there's a systemic problem as you do?
I do think he does. When talking to the president, he said very clearly the actions in Minnesota was terrible, and he even questioned what is going on with the other three officers. So when we have a president who's willing to listen, we're in a better position. I hope that over the next 7 days, you'll see some skin on the bones of some of the recommendations. I have a piece of legislation called the Walter Scott Notification Act that would help us understand the police shootings around the country. There's no one place you can go to get the information today. So I'm hoping that we'll see that and other pieces of legislation going forward.
All right. Senator Scott, thank you so much for being with us this morning.